On February 4th of 1974, 19-year-old Patty Hearst was kidnapped in Berkeley, California by a group of people who called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA. They burst into the apartment that she was in with her then fiance, and they beat up her fiance and kidnapped her. And the FBI began a huge manhunt in terms of just manpower exercise. It was one of the largest FBI operations in history, and they were searching for her for months and couldn't find her. The SLA was having her release hostage videos, essentially, and putting her parents through this just incredible trauma. Pay this, do that, jump through that hoop to get her back. They couldn't find her, couldn't get her back. The case took a shocking turn, however, in the beginning of April, when the SLA robbed a bank. And when they looked at footage of the bank robbery, they saw Patty on the footage. But she wasn't a victim in this video. She was like an active member of the SLA. She was holding a weapon. She was getting people up against the wall. She was actively participating in this group. And about a week later, Patty, while she was in the SLA, sent a video to the authorities. She was calling herself Tanya, and she was saying, I've joined the SLA out of my own free will. She was completely and totally brainwashed by her 2 months in with this group, and she joined. And she spent the next year, the FBI was still looking for her and trying to bring her home, but now she was actually working. Her captors sort of became co-conspirators, and she was working with them and running away from the FBI. It took them over a year to finally find her and capture her. On September 18th, 1975, she and some of these captors become conspirators were finally caught by the FBI. And it was obviously a really difficult situation as the authorities were looking at how to respond to that, because this is someone who was kidnapped and severely traumatized, and at the same time, at some point, began to understand themselves as part of this group. And so the authorities were sort of like, what should or shouldn't she be charged with? And she was eventually charged for crimes that she committed as part of the SLA, in particular the bank robbery. She was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. And after serving about 2 of those years, her sentence was commuted by then President Carter. Around 2002, she was back in the news for a brief moment because one of the crimes that had been committed in her time there was finally getting prosecuted, and she was a key witness in the crime, and she was interviewed on Larry King Live. And this is what she said about her time and her self-understanding while she was brainwashed and living under the domination of the wills and thoughts of other people while she was in the SLA. She said this: "Most of the time I was with them, my mind was going through exactly what I was supposed to do. I had been educated very well in what to do. You know, I had no free will. I had virtually no free will until I was separated from them for about 2 weeks, and then suddenly, you know, slowly began to dawn that they just weren't there anymore. I could actually think my own thoughts. I could actually think my own thoughts." It's possible for us to live lives that are dominated by the thoughts and wills and desires and hopes and dreams of other people. Patty's life is obviously an extreme and traumatic example of what this can look like, but our own lives can fall under the same sort of domination of other people in less traumatic and obvious ways. We can live lives that are governed by the dreams that we think are ours, but actually if we get underneath them, they're the dreams of other people. And our lives are governed by the dreams of other people. We live lives that are governed by the hopes of other people. We live someone else's morality. We reach a point where we actually go, I'm sort of thinking someone else's thoughts. I've had someone else's voice running in my head, or a dominant person running in my mind, in my thought, in my spirit for so long that I'm actually thinking their thoughts. I'm not thinking my thoughts at all. And we start living under the burden of actually living out somebody else's life. We live out somebody else's life. And while this whole thing is happening, we live under the additional burden of feeling like I need to be somebody else. I need to be somebody other than who I am. Is this what life is supposed to be like, however? Is this what life is actually like? Is living simply a matter of trying to become who everybody else wants us to be? Why are we content to live lives dominated by the wills and opinions and thoughts of other people? These are some of the questions that we're going to be asking today. We're walking through a sermon series in the book of Galatians. We're going to be today in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 to 31. If you have not heard the other sermons from the Galatians series, there's a lot of other context in those things, and you can engage with them on your own time. You can find all of those online and get a lot of context. All you need to know today is that the Galatians are first century Christians. They're living in the Roman province of Galatia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they've come under the influence of a teaching that is telling them that they need to do a whole bunch of things. They need to get a whole bunch of things right in order to live a full and satisfying life. And of course, there are things that other people are coming to them and saying, you need to do these things that we think you need to do in order to live a life that is meaningful or satisfying. And the Apostle Paul thinks that this is so antithetical to the good news of the gospel of Jesus, not just God's grace for us, but the idea that we can live in relationship to a God that knows us and calls us into things based on his promises and not based on his morality. And so Paul is writing to them, trying to get them out from under this teaching. Again, we're going to be today in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 to 31. I'm not going to have the text up on the screen. If you've got a Bible, you can open it up or pull it up on a device and have it open, because we'll engage with the text as we go along. This is Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 to 31. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who lost a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of the promise. But just as that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. We are in bondage when our lives are governed by the wills of other people. We are in bondage when we live lives that are governed by the wills of other people. This is what Paul is saying when he talks about the son of the slave woman who is born according to the flesh in verse 23. The text here says he was born according to the flesh. Now, when we think of flesh at first versus promise, we might sort of have like an immaculate conception sort of thing in our mind. Like this person was born according to the flesh literally mean like physical procreation, whereas something else was happening with Isaac. But actually, if we were to dive into the Genesis account, it's really quite likely that what happened with Isaac was also that he was conceived through physical means, but God removed an obstacle of infertility, either in Sarah or in Abraham, to make that child come to be. So according to the flesh is probably not here referring to physical intercourse. What it's probably referring to is the way in which Ishmael, Hagar's son, was born according to the desires and machinations of humans. He was born according to the flesh. He was born because someone looked at a situation and said, we need something to enter in here to satisfy my thoughts, my desires, my hopes, and my dreams. In that way, Ishmael was born according to the flesh. Ishmael was born according to the flesh, in particular of Sarah, of Abram's wife, who had to live in the ancient world with the shame and the burden of not having any children. This is what the text says about the events that occasioned the birth of Ishmael in Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 to 4. Now Sarah, before her name has been changed to Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servants, that it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. The text here that's so important is that I shall obtain children by her. Hagar's giving birth to Ishmael, and so Ishmael is born according to the flesh, in that there is a desire, a machination, a thought, a need of Sarah's that needs to be met by the bringing forth of Ishmael. And as a result, he's born according to the flesh. And so Ishmael's entire being, as a result, is defined by the will of Sarah and her wants and her needs and her desires. Now, of course, Sarah, to live in the ancient world in this way, where she would have had to bear up under this shame, it is so painful and so challenging and in many ways so devastating that obviously she's a sympathetic character. Everyone in this story is a sympathetic character. Everyone's just trying to figure out how to deal with their own pain. And as a result, they just hurt other people along the way. And so Sarah's a sympathetic character. Wonderful. And so Sarah's a sympathetic person. She's a sympathetic character who, by the way, reached for a solution that was very common in the ancient world and said, I don't know, God told us we're going to have this child, but it's not happening, and so I need to exert my will and figure out a way to get this done. But in doing that, she's created, not just for Ishmael, but for Hagar, which we'll see a little bit later, a situation where the identities of these other people are now governed by the wills and desires of humans, and not the wills and desires of God. We, in our own lives, in the same way, can be constantly born and reborn in our lives in different ways, out from the wills and desires of other people. Think, for example, of the child who lives under the weight and the expectations of the unfulfilled dreams or hurts or disappointments of their parents. Right? The child for whom the parent had something they wanted to have happen in life and it didn't happen, so they're living vicariously through the child. And so sure, in that relationship, ideally there's still real love and real tenderness and real joy, but there's this other element that's present now in that relational dynamic where it's like the needs of another human are getting worked out in and through the identity and being of this child. And that begins to shape and define a whole element of that person's identity as according to the flesh. Or maybe the spouse who feels defined by their partner's need to have life go a certain way. Maybe you've been with someone in a partner relationship or a married relationship for multiple years, and over time you sort of realize, oh gosh, this person actually had a vision of how their life was going to be, down the road. And they loved me, but they also were looking for someone who was going to fit into that mold. And I was that person. They had that need that was getting worked out through me. Maybe something simpler, just like social dynamics, like the friend who's been pigeonholed in their social circle as the funny person, or the helpful person, or the whatever else person you can be in a social circle. And in order to show up there and fit in and belong, you have to be that person over and over again. Right? That's what you have to do. You have to show up and be that. I wonder if any of these sound familiar to you. Ways in which you show up and who you are and your own self-understanding is defined by the needs and desires of another person. Either in a deep and lasting way, maybe with your parents, or a relationship, an intimate relationship, or just showing up and feeling I'm just here in a social environment. I just want to be able to be myself. Why do I have to show up in this way over and over again? These expectations become laws to us. They become laws. They become external standards that we have to live up to over and over and over again. And we sit in bondage to them and are defined by them and our inability to fulfill them. And in these things, we become born over and over and over again in our lives according to the flesh, according to the wills and desires of other human beings. This is what Paul is saying to the Galatians. He's saying that what happened with Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael is an archetype of something that happens over and over and over again in our relationships with other people, but ultimately in our relationships with God. This is what he says when he says, now this may be interpreted allegorically. He's saying what happened here in this relationship is a type and a pattern and a mold that relationships can fall into over and over and over and over again. And in our lives, in our relationship with other people, our relationship with God, when they become determined ultimately by the thoughts and desires and dreams and hopes of other people, we become, as Paul is saying here in this allegorical interpretation, children of Hagar. People whose lives are determined by the machinations of human flesh and the desires and wills of other people. This happens in our own lives over and over and over again. The 19th century essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "The hardest challenge is to be yourself in a world where everyone is trying to make you somebody else." And this is like the story of our lives. We come up against this over and over and over again. The burden and the weights and the bondage and the failure, the constant failure of having been defined by the thoughts and wills and dreams and desires of other people and not being able to live up to them. What do we do in this place when we experience this? Maybe we try to live under it for a while. Maybe we're like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to jump over that bar. And maybe you jumped over it once, then you're like, I'm going to jump over it again and again. And we can sort of do that for a while. We try to figure that out. But at some point, something inside of us goes, this isn't how it's supposed to be. No. At some point, we begin to recognize the instrumentality of the way that other people are looking at us, using us maybe. And we go, actually, that's not who I should be. That should not determine or define who I should be. And so what do? We run away. We run away from that. We're like, how can I get out of proximity to those voices that are trying to make me into somebody else? And we do anything we can to get away from these burdens as we run away when they're born out of the wills of others. And so sometimes what we do when we run away like that is we seek to create and define ourselves according to our own wills. We say, oh gosh, I'm not supposed to be defined by somebody else. Maybe I'm supposed to be defined by me. Maybe I'm supposed to say who I am and the things that I want to be true about myself. But if it's true that our lives are lives of bondage, if they're governed by the wills of others, it is also true that our lives are lives of lostness when they become governed by nothing but ourselves. If we're in bondage when we're defined by other people, the reality is that we're lost when we just think we're going to be defined by ourselves. We are lost when our lives are governed by our own wills. This is what Hagar does. At some point, living in this dynamic, while she's pregnant with Ishmael, she runs away. She runs away from these people who are trying to define her in this way. This is what the text of Genesis says in Genesis 16, verses 7 to 8, about Hagar's running away from being defined by these other people. The text says this: "The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to shore. And he said, 'Hagar, son of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?' She said, 'I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai.' Where have you come from, and where are you going?" Hagar's running away makes total sense. And we do that all the time in our own lives when we come to recognize these external voices as something that's trying to make us into something that we're not. We run away, and that's totally reasonable and understandable. And at the same time, when we do this, we lose a sense of ourself, because me running away from that thing is not an identity. That's like a season or a transition. But it's not an identity. It can't make us and tell us who we actually are. Our identities, when they're built on running away, is not actually an identity. And identities that over time are only about, I'm running away from that thing over there, are ultimately identities that are chronically adolescent. They don't ever grow up. We don't ever find out who we actually are. Because me running away from that thing over there isn't an identity. We become lost. We don't know who we are. And this is reflected in the text with Hagar, because she doesn't answer the question, where are you going? Right? In Genesis 16, 7 to 8, when the angel of the Lord says, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarah." That doesn't answer the question, where are you going? She doesn't know where she's going. And when our whole identity is built on, I'm running away from that over there, that doesn't answer the question for me, where am I going? It just answers the question, where have I come from? And I needed to get away from that thing, or that person, or that voice, or that set of ideas. But it doesn't give me a direction. And so it doesn't give me a self. It doesn't give me me. It doesn't give me an understanding who I am. We become unable to answer the question, where am I going? And this same panic and lostness sets in our own lives when they're just determined by the idea that I'm going to define myself because I'm running away from that thing over there. If what's hard in this category, if what's hard when someone else is trying to reach in and make us into something, if what's hard about that is the oppression and the weight and burden of those forces, what's hard over here is the fact that we feel totally out to sea once we've sat in that place for enough time. We feel like I have no idea who I am. All I know is that I'm not that thing. But I actually don't feel peace in here because I don't know who I am. This dynamic is beautifully reflected in Stephen Sondheim's musical Into the Woods, which I think Zach recently saw the production, right? Did you see it before they did the cast switchover? And he said it lived up to the hype. So, I mean, you should see it if you can. In the song No More, one of the major characters is talking to this guy called the Mysterious Man. And one of the major characters is thinking about basically running away from his problems. And the Mysterious Man replies to him with these lines. Running away, go to it. Where did you have in mind? Have to take care. Unless there's a where, you'll only be wandering blind. Just more questions of different kinds. He goes on to say, running away, we'll do it. Why sit around resigned? Trouble is, son, the farther you run, the more you'll feel undefined. The more you'll feel undefined. There are times in our lives when we need to run away from this thing over here, this thing that said, you need to be this. You need to fulfill that dream, you need to fulfill that hope. But just running away chronically and constantly doesn't tell us where we're going. And so it doesn't tell us who we are. And so we've exchanged the oppression and burden of trying to live out somebody else's law for the fear, the frank panic of going, I have no idea who I am. This doesn't just happen in our own lives. We live in a culture and a society that's running away from itself. Our culture is in that movement in its life. Our culture and society has looked back on its past and said, that was an authoritarian, morality-obsessed, cruel, law-based society, where we told everybody what they had to do in order to be good, in order to belong, and all of that was wrong. And the reaction from that, the running away from that, is just saying, we're not that anymore. And so this thing over here is, you're free. And freedom looks like you're free to not be that thing. You're free to not do that thing. But it's actually not able to tell you what it is to live well and to be yourself and to become a person who lives in a relationship to a vision of the good that sets you free to be who you are. It just says you're free to not do that thing anymore. And so we're in a place culturally where we look like, oh my gosh, we've grown so much, we have so much freedom, and yet all over our culture, all over our society, we are seeing the fruits of people who are just shoving down as much as they can every day, the sheer panic of going, I am apparently free from all this stuff, but I have no idea who I am. The philosopher Charles Taylor writes about this in his book, Sources of the Self. I want to give kind of an elongated quote here. Bear with me. This is what he says. He says, the problem of meaning, or the problem of the meaning of life is therefore on our agenda being modern people today, modern Western people. The problem of the meaning of life is therefore on our agenda. Those whose spiritual agenda is mainly defined in this way are fundamentally different, he says, in a different existential predicament from that which dominated most previous cultures, in which an unchallengeable framework makes imperious demands which we fear being unable to meet. The form of the danger here, in those societies, that are about the frameworks, the imperious demands, is utterly different from that which threatens the modern seekers, which is something close to the opposite. The world loses altogether its spiritual contour. Nothing is worth doing. The fear is of a terrifying emptiness. He goes on to say, the existential predicament in which one fears condemnation is quite different from the one where one fears above all meaninglessness. The dominance of the latter perhaps defines our age. He's saying that in most previous cultures, the culture has given you a moral framework where you understand yourself against that framework. And you might not always be on the right side of that framework, but at least the framework let you know when you were doing good or bad. It set your life in a context of meaning. Now, there are challenges to that. And for those who can't live into that framework for whatever reason, either because of their own failure or just the sheer brute facts of life, there's condemnation there. But over here, which is what Taylor says we're in as a culture, we have a totally different but equally dangerous predicament. Where because we have no framework whatsoever, we're freed from that. We have the sheer panic of going, I have no way of understanding what's meaningful in my life and who I am and where I fit into it. And so we live in a time when we maybe are tempted generally in our lives to run away from these other frameworks, where as we experience like the running away in our own life, the getting away from the condemnation of those frameworks, we actually live in a time and a place in a society where we're encouraged to do that more and more. And so it feels like there's a societal track that is saying, you're free from this thing over here, but it's actually putting you into this place that the whole culture is in, where we feel afraid of living a meaningless life. This is what our world has to offer us, apparently. A life that's governed by the will of others. Everybody needs me to be somebody else. But if I choose a life governed by my own will, inevitably I will come to a place where I have no idea who I am. These are our options according to the world. Either everybody needs me to be somebody else, or I don't know who I am. In this world, this is all we have, oscillating between people are trying to make me somebody else, and I don't know who I am. But Paul says that there's a world of God, which he describes in this passage as the Jerusalem from above. He says there's a Jerusalem from above where we are not born out of the wills of other people or our own wills, but out of the wills and promises of God. And that sets us free from either horn of this dilemma. It sets us free to grow up on a good trellis of the promises of God, which aren't a condemning law, but they also are not just structureless nothing. They're a path that we can walk in relationship to the promises and plans of God, where I grow up into the person that God is creating me to be. In this, God's will comes to us not through law, but through promise. This is the other half of this passage. He says, these women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, but the other is from the Jerusalem that is above and is free. And she is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud. For you are not, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those who has a husband. Now you, brothers like Isaac, are children of promise. Promise is able to solve the question of our identity, because it comes to us in the specificity of the present as me, who I am right now, but it brings us immediately into relationship with the potentiality of a future. And in that place, we have a track to run on in relationship to God, where I am me right now. I don't have to be someone other than I am right now with God, because God's promise meets me in the present, but implicitly it brings us into something that says there's somewhere where you're going in the future. It answers the question that Hagar's not able to answer. Where are you going? Where are you going? With God's promises, we say, I'm going to the place that God has promised me. It solves that question for us and also comes to us in the present, in who we actually are. This is what God is doing through the line of what God did in Isaac. Because Isaac is born not out of the machinations of human wills. He's born out of the promise of God. That's why Isaac is born. And through Isaac and leading into Jesus, God has desired from the beginning of time to give birth to children of God whose identities are born in relationship, not of the wills of other people or not a need to define ourselves, but where we become who we're made to be through God's promises and by living in relationship to God's promises. This is what the text is getting at. Of all the things the text of John chapter 1, 12 and 13 is getting at, this is one of the things this text is getting at. The text says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." And the language here, being born of the flesh, is the same idea here that Paul's talking about here, being born according to the flesh. How do we lay hold of a promise? If a promise has a present reality and a future reality, how do we lay hold of the whole thing at the same time? Belief. Belief is the mechanism by which we lay hold of the promise. Because we have belief now in the specificity of who I am right now, but it's belief about something in the future. Belief in Jesus, the heir to everything that God was doing in Isaac, is the way in which we have access to an identity that's built on the promises of God. Belief in Jesus. The amazing thing about this, the payoff for all of this, is that this can lead to profound personal transformation in our own lives. Because we find ourselves strangely able to go back into those situations that were once unhealthy, right? That unhelpful family dynamic where you had to be something for your family system, right? That social circle where you're sort of playing a role here, and at one point it's oppressive, but then at some point you're able to go back and be in that space and be with those people. Like, how does that happen when someone's able to do that? How do they come to a place where they're like, I'm actually so sure now of who I am that I can show up in this dynamic and have my own integrity, but now have something different to offer the people that are here. Not being a new law to them, saying, here's what I've learned, you've got to do it, but where I can offer them something different because there's something different about me. This happens in our lives when our lives are built on the promises of God. And it happens for Hagar. It happens for Hagar. In Genesis chapter 16, verses 9 to 10, this is what the text says. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. Which is like a challenging verse for someone who is on the underside of all sorts of power dynamics in the ancient world. Why would God put her back in that situation? God would only tell her to go back there if he was going to give her something she didn't have the first time around. That could give her something new and different in that set of relationships. And what does God give her? He gives her a different identity based on promises and not on the laws of humans. Verse 10, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for a multitude. God says, if you're going to have to go back there, I'm going to give you a promise so that your identity now can be free from being in relationship to the wills and machinations of humans, but can now live specifically in relationship to who I say you are and who I say you're going to be. And when God gives you that, you become able not just to live at peace with yourself, but we become people who are able to go back into those places that we were in, where at once we were just burdened by the condemnation of be this, do that, live my dream, live my hope. And we can go back in there and say, you're probably still going to try to do all that to me again. But like, I'm defined now in relationship to the promises of God. And so I'm able to be here and be a gracious and truthful presence with you, but I also have my own integrity. Like, wouldn't people who are like that just change the world, frankly? Wouldn't people who are like that just change every single relational system that they were in? Change their families, change their extended families, change their work environments, change their friendship circles, change their marriages. If we were able to do that, the amount of change that would happen in the world. So how do we do this? Paul says it right at the end. Stop living under the will of humans and start living under the promises of God. The world is always trying to keep us under the opinions of the world. That's why Paul says in verse 29, but just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But Paul says, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit the son of the free woman. Now, Paul here is reading Hagar within the specifically allegorical interpretation, right? We've already looked at the Genesis text where God has promises for Hagar. But within Paul's interpretive framework here, in this allegory, Paul is saying, you need to cast out those places and sources in your life where someone is bound and determined to make you just an expression of their own will and their own thought and their own desire, and receive instead the promises of God. And so we all have to ask the questions of ourselves. What opinions of other people am I living under? What are the things that I'm doing in my life, or things I believe, or ways that I'm acting, that if I were actually to get all the way down and then tell the truth about them, I would find that that's something my parent back there told me. Or that's something that I inherited from this culture. Or that's something I got from a friend, or a bad experience I had in school, or some place or way in my life where something I'm doing, a chronic thing, is coming out of the opinions of other people. And this could be like something that we learn from the world, but it also could be like something that we learn from the church. There are some of us who have been in church for so long that we have some voices that we've learned in religious communities that are doing that for us. And those can be some of the hardest voices to define, because since they came from a religious community, we're like, it must be right. But some of those things actually are the will of humans going in the name of church or God being executed in our lives. And we need to find those things and say, no, not anymore. I've seen that. I'm going to say no to it. I'm also not going to respond by just saying, and here's me instead. But I'm going to say, I'm going to bring that into dialogue with God and God's promises, and allow who God created me to be to grow up along the good structure of the promises of God. This is what we have to do. We have to do that work of finding those things and then casting them out to make room for the promises of God to be the things that defines who we are in our lives.